Do you ever find yourself effortlessly diving into video games or endlessly scrolling through social media on your phone? It's almost like time flies when you're engrossed in those activities. This is because we live in a world where we are constantly exposed to stimuli. Every social media post is geared to give us a short rush of pleasure, which is followed by feelings of emptiness and a deep sense of craving for more. Studies show that an average person spends about 3 hours a day looking at their computer screens and about 4 hours a day looking at their smartphone. That's a total of 7 hours, which means nearly a third of our day is spent looking at a digital screen. But what about committing just half an hour to studying or dedicating an hour to work on your side hustle? Suddenly, it feels like pulling teeth. Why is that? Even though we know deep down that these tasks will benefit us more in the long run, we still gravitate towards the easier, more mindless options. To address this question, we will first need to examine and understand what dopamine is. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that affects our movement, motivation, mood, and reward. It's associated with pleasure and reinforcement of our behaviors. Dopamine is released when we engage in enjoyable activities, and it plays a key role in motivating us to repeat those activities. In certain circumstances, dopamine can be beneficial to us as it helps us to accomplish our goals. For example, when you set and achieve the goal of going to the gym 3 times a week, your brain releases a healthy amount of dopamine, which gives you a sense of accomplishment and improves your overall well-being. However, video games, social media platforms, and pornography provide constant stimuli, ensuring that your brain remains in a state of anticipation by continually releasing dopamine. You have likely experienced the feeling of intending to have a productive day, only to realize at day's end that you've squandered hours mindlessly scrolling through social media and attending to notifications. This results in wasted time, self-criticism, and a diminished capacity to find joy in activities that once brought excitement. It's worth noting that almost every activity elicits some degree of dopamine release, even simple actions like drinking water when thirsty. However, the highest levels of dopamine release occur when rewards are unpredictable. This is evident in activities like playing slot machines in a casino. Despite continuous losses, the anticipation of a big win keeps the dopamine flowing, driving the urge to continue, fueled by the uncertainty of when the reward might come. The profound impact of dopamine can also be seen through a series of experiments conducted by neuroscientists on rats. These researchers surgically implanted electrodes into the rats' brains. Each time a rat pulled a lever, the scientists activated the rat's reward system in the brain. The outcome was remarkable. The rats developed an insatiable craving, relentlessly pulling the lever for hours on end. They became so consumed by this activity that they neglected basic necessities such as eating and sleeping. Their incessant lever pulling continued until they collapsed from sheer exhaustion. However, when the researchers disrupted the release of dopamine in the brain's reward center, the rats experienced a drastic shift. They became so lethargic that the simplest tasks, like fetching water, seemed too arduous for them to bother with. They essentially lost interest in performing the most basic of necessities, like eating and drinking. This experiment highlights the effects of dopamine and how it can be observed in not only humans, but animals as well. In fact, our brain establishes priorities largely based on the anticipated dopamine levels. If an activity triggers insufficient dopamine release, we'll likely lack motivation to pursue it. Conversely, activities that result in substantial dopamine release tend to compel us to repeat them, often in a repetitive cycle, essentially making us slaves to these behaviors in pursuit of the next satisfying dopamine rush. You might be tempted to dismiss this notion, asking yourself, "What's the big deal? It doesn't seem to be that harmful." However, you would be greatly mistaken. To understand, let's examine a concept called homeostasis. Our bodies function within the framework of homeostasis, which is a mechanism dedicated to preserving a harmonious internal state, both in terms of physicality and chemistry. For example, a person who seldom drinks alcohol will become intoxicated quickly, while a regular drinker requires more alcohol to feel the effects due to their increased tolerance. Similarly, with dopamine, our bodies adapt to maintain balance. Over time, frequent exposure to high levels of dopamine leads to a decrease of dopamine receptors, making elevated dopamine levels the new norm. Consequently, we develop a tolerance to dopamine, requiring more of it to experience the same effects. This phenomenon isn't exclusive to alcoholics. Individuals addicted to video games, social media, drugs, or internet pornography also encounter similar challenges. Their heightened dopamine tolerance makes it difficult for them to find fulfillment in everyday tasks that don't provide the same dopamine rush. Once their dopamine tolerance gets too high, they simply aren't able to enjoy low-dopamine behaviors, even though those are the activities that provide long-term benefits. Thankfully, there is a way to regain control over your impulses and take your power back through a practice called dopamine detoxing. Dopamine detox is the act of fasting from high dopamine-producing activities or pleasures with the hope of decreasing reward sensitivity. This involves dedicating a period to abstaining from highly stimulating activities, effectively halting the flood of dopamine into your brain and allowing your dopamine receptors to recover. Ideally, by the end of the detox, the person will experience an increased sense of awareness, and they'll be less affected by their usual dopamine triggers. To perform a dopamine detox, you must first identify the behavior or activities in your lives that overstimulate your dopamine system. According to scientific research, there are 6 categories of behavior activities which are commonly problematic and prone to addiction. They are emotional eating, internet use and video games, gambling and shopping, porn and masturbation, thrill and novelty seeking, and recreational drugs. They are usually activities that provide instant but short-lived pleasure. Once the behavior has been identified, you should try to identify the stimulus control that causes you to engage in these behaviors. For example, when your phone plays a notification sound, you will pick up your phone to check what it is. The notification sound is the stimulus, and checking your phone is the behavior. So, to combat this issue, there are 2 solutions which you can undertake. Firstly, you can remove the stimulus by putting your phone in another room or disable notifications. If not, you can also engage in an activity that is not compatible with using your phone, like going for a jog or swimming. Alternatively, you can also practice a cognitive behavioral therapy approach called exposure and response prevention, in which you intentionally expose yourself to stimuli without engaging in the conditioned response. In this case, you purposefully place your phone within reach, and the moment you hear a notification, you'll need to force yourself not to pick it up. This approach forces you to tolerate the urge and boredom without the habit you use to cope. This theoretically increases your tolerance for urges and lessens the habit's power on you. Once you have identified the behavior and stimulus, you should aim to abstain from these overstimulating activities for a specific period and substitute them with less stimulating activities such as reading, exercising, walking in nature, and spending quality time with friends and family. So, you might be wondering, how long should I perform dopamine detox? Dopamine detox typically lasts around 90 days, but this can vary depending on individual preference and needs, as each person has a unique relationship with the reward system in their brain. For example, if your goal is to maximize the effectiveness of dopamine detox, it'll be best to perform it daily. However, if you're hesitant to undergo a full-blown dopamine detox, you can perform a smaller-scale detox instead. There are a couple of ways which this can be done. One way is to set a schedule. Choose one day of the week to abstain completely from one of your high dopamine behaviors. It could be anything from incessantly checking your phone, binge-watching TV, consuming junk food, indulging in video games, or even watching internet pornography. From now on, every single week, dedicate one entire day to avoiding that chosen activity. You're still free to engage in other pursuits, but that specific behavior is off limits. Yes, you may experience some boredom, but that's precisely the point. Another way to perform a smaller-scale dopamine detox is via a reward system. So instead of completely avoiding high dopamine behaviors one day a week, you could use high dopamine activities as incentives for pursuing tasks that contribute to your overall well-being. In essence, you can use these activities as rewards for completing more challenging work. For example, for every hour of low dopamine work you complete, reward yourself with 15 minutes of high dopamine behavior at the end of the day. This means that for every 8 hours of low dopamine tasks completed, you can take part in 2 hours of high dopamine activities. By refraining from constant high dopamine activity, you allow your dopamine receptors to recover from the overload they've been subjected to. Furthermore, boredom can serve as a catalyst for exploring other activities that you might typically neglect due to their lower dopamine release. Since you're bored, you're more inclined to tackle these tasks, making it easier to accomplish them. So, if you're struggling with motivation issues, I strongly encourage you to start detoxing your brain from excessive dopamine as soon as possible. By distancing yourself from unnaturally high dopamine levels, or at least reducing exposure, you will pave the way for everyday, low dopamine activities to regain their appeal. This means you'll find more joy and satisfaction in the little things, and you'll be able to stick with them for longer periods with a newfound enthusiasm. Will you prioritize activities that offer fleeting satisfaction but little long-term benefit? Or will you channel your dopamine towards endeavors that align with your long-term goals? Ultimately, the choice is yours. Decide consciously where you want to derive your dopamine from, whether it's from instant gratification or from the fulfillment of pursuing your aspirations. It's your decision that will shape the direction of your journey. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, I would greatly appreciate if you could like and subscribe, as it'll help signal to the YouTube algorithm that this content is worth sharing, and it'll recommend my video to a larger audience. I look forward to creating more videos like this to help and inspire people. Together, let's spread the word and help more people live better and healthier lives.